Welcome to the Business Women Australia podcast show, the podcast that brings together industry leaders to discuss the latest trends, insights, and strategies. So sit back and relax. Let's get inspired by the amazing women who are shaping the future of professional women in Australia. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Welcome everyone today to our podcast show. And for those who know me, and especially those who know me well, it's actually a really important topic that's very close to my heart. And I have the most amazing guest who is helping a lot of women who have been in my situation, who have gone through it all. And we're talking about women with ADHD, and we're going to be unmasking ADHD and why women are being diagnosed late. My beautiful guest is Kirstin Bouse, who's a founder of All About Her, and this is one of her beloved specialties, which is one of the things that we've connected so well on. And I'd just like to give you a very warm welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I love chatting about this topic, particularly kind of the midlife ADHD combination. And it's really lovely to actually get a chance to talk to you on the podcast, or not on the podcast, on the stream. What are we calling this?
It's a live podcast. So there will be people who'll be tuning into our great podcasting stations, Apple, Spotify later on. So they'll only hear our voices. Yep. You get everybody else on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook that get to see our gorgeous faces. And a lot of people don't realize what I love about this is, so for me growing up, a bit of my backstory is I was basically made to think I was a little bit crazy, thinking I was ADHD. And I've even had a doctor tell me that I wasn't ADHD because I had neat handwriting, which even as I say it now, it was my brothers got diagnosed, and it wasn't until I had children that I went, yeah, I know where I'm at.
Yeah.
And what made you go on, and you've had this big change and you found All About Her? What made you decide to go into this and make this your specialty?
Oh gosh, I feel as though many roads have led me to this particular kind of point. As you know, I've had a number of businesses. I had a group psychology practice for 18 years, which I sold in August. And the reason I sold that is because it had gotten to, I guess, a point where, with all the regulation from just a small business perspective, as well as being a health regulated business, it made it quite unfun, but also prevented me from doing, following my passions and interests as much as I wanted to. And those passions and interests being, helping women navigate the menopausal transition, and also, those with the added layer of a midlife diagnosis of ADHD. Previously, the group practice had provided me with lots of flexibility and freedom to pursue different interests, which is why quite some time ago I had the Conscious Mother as well as a business. But, things change, things get tighter, regulations, compliance, governance, and all the rest. And it was just at the point, in order to really kind of sustain that practice, I would have had to have given up my interest or not pursued it. And it was too important to me to give up, basically. And the reason it was important, like what led me to it, was this kind of, I call it the trifecta. I had the well, maybe I need to add a fourth, but I'll stick with the three for now. So on the back of a separation and divorce, and how I kind of, responded to that in the sense of feeling quite unsure financially, and really feeling as though I was starting again at kind of 43 years of age, and all the rest. I worked my butt off in my practice. And the trifecta ended up being burnout, diagnosed burnout. I had to take quite a period of time out of my clinical work. And then also perimenopause, and also a late diagnosis of ADHD myself. And like most women who get a diagnosis at this, somewhere in their 40s, it's usually in the context of their kids having received a diagnosis and walking through that process with them, and kind of thinking, oh, I recognize myself in some of this stuff. So for me, those 3 experiences really got me to a point where it was like, I particularly think perimenopause and late diagnosis ADHD, they really prompt you to evaluate who you are, how you've come to be the person you are, and what you want out of life and what's really important to you. And I think, ADHD is something that you have your whole life, but if you don't know you have it until you're in your kind of 40s, you have to then make sense of yourself through an entirely new lens. Like I felt as though I understood who I was, but I always explained it through life experience, family, my role in the family and all of those kinds of things, which are all very, very relevant. But getting a late diagnosis of ADHD added a whole other dimension that I needed to kind of now rework how I understood myself, and things. And perimenopause definitely does that too. I think it's a stage in women's lives where we become very reflective and usually quite confused in the beginning and lost and
feel that one.
Not in a great place, but where we land is a place of really kind of, okay, where do I want to go from here? Who do I want to be from here? And burnout as well was that scenario where I had no choice but to actually stop. I got so unwell that I was forced to really, really, really pull back on life. So for me, those things were very critical experiences for me, and significant experiences for me. And in that process, what I realized is how little support there was for women with 1, 2, or all 3 of those things. And I have to say, I think it's sad that a lot of midlife women do enter midlife burnt out or very, very close to it. So I think that's a really common thing. And then, perimenopause and or burnout just reduces our capacity to kind of keep pretending, keep masking, keep juggling the things that we do, keep using all the compensatory strategies. They start to fail us when you get that combination. And when I looked around to get support for myself in different ways to manage all of these, events and experiences in my life, I found it really bloody difficult to find people, health practitioners. And I'm a pretty persistent person, maybe not as persistent in that tricky stage of life as was before and I am now. But I just thought it can't be that hard. I have to make it easier for other women to be able to find a range of health practitioners from different disciplines, because we need different things at different kind of stages in this whole midlife transition. I have to help make it easier for them to find, some help, basically. Some help from health practitioners with that special interest in menopause in particular, or perimenopausal space. And in doing that, also then I discovered how hard it was to find a practitioner like a psych, for example, who understood the combination of menopause and ADHD in order to either be able to do a really thorough neuroaffirming assessment and or, I guess, work with women who'd already had a diagnosis and to help support them. So that's really what prompted me to create All About Her, and it's definitely what has me saying yes when people ask me to have a conversation about it, because there's just, it's a challenging time, and I don't want women to walk through this time on their own.
And I think that's so important because, perimenopause, perimenopause, women naturally feel like we're losing our mind anyway. Mm-hmm. With ADHD, it kind of exacerbates.
Absolutely.
That. So finding that, there's someone's going, no, you know what, you're not crazy. Yeah. You're not losing your mind. You're not doing things wrong. And, the brain fog that comes with it, to actually help clear that path. Yeah. I think once people realize, there is a path forward and it's okay, it's so important, because we also tend to put everyone else first.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel
Yeah.
like
So
we do.
so taking the step back and going, oh no, I'm just busy. I find is a big thing. And it's like, do you know what? You are, but find someone to help you, because living in that brain fog and the anxiety that can come with it. And, sometimes my anxiety used to get quite debilitating, whereas the overwhelm, and I'd be sitting on the couch realizing I was quite close to burnout a lot of times. And it's like,
Yeah.
breathe.
Yeah.
And when you do realize, do you know what? You're not crazy. It's ADHD and you're fine. It's like the colors in the world can open up.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that is how, look, I think for me, I'll be honest with you, I was diagnosed and I took probably a year to accept it. And the accepting, or my resistance to accepting it, wasn't anything to do with stigma or any, I wasn't ashamed. I'm not ashamed. But I just really, I guess, kept coming back to, but how could I have achieved all the things that I've achieved? And that really highlighted and highlights how naive I was. I mean, I'm a clinical psychologist. I've not worked with kids since very early in my career. And often if you work with kids, you'll always have some kids on your caseload with ADHD. I know that. I know enough child psychs. So I haven't had that kind of experience. It wasn't my area of expertise, neurodivergence, in any way, shape or form. I am of the vintage where there was not even one lecture in my entire 3 degrees across 6 years on ADHD in kids, let alone in adults, and let alone in midlife women. So I was very, very naive. I had wondered a lot about my youngest, who's now 16, but every time I spoke to his teachers in primary school, they were like, oh, he's just a busy boy. He's your third. You know what boys are like. And so I'm like, well, they've certainly spent a heck of a lot more time with kids than I have. And so I dismissed it. The wheels came off for him in high school, and it was kind of one by one when his older brothers got diagnosed, and then myself. What I experienced, as I said, is I kind of quite a lot of disbelief. And then I'd have this conversation with myself, and the conversation went something like this. Oh, it's just everyone's seeing it everywhere, including the psychiatrist. Sorry, I won't name her. Sorry, but that was my initial thought. And then I'd think, oh, don't be so arrogant, Kirstin. This is not your area of expertise. If your psychiatrist is saying that this is, you're an ADHD, then you take it on board. And I flip-flopped and flip-flopped and flip-flopped. And eventually, I went and did find myself a psychologist to kind of unpack it all and make sense of it. And it was, funnily enough, the very reason why I thought I couldn't be ADHD, which was my career and my career success by my definition, was how I thought I can't have ADHD. What I realized is it actually can be attributed to ADHD, like the cool stuff can be attributed to it. And so, and then of course spoke to friends who do work in this space. I've got lots of psych friends, and they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And I'm like, you could have given me the memo, like you've known me for a long time. But often, that's my experience, but often what I find when I work with women is quite a mixed reaction. So women can often feel sad and angry that others have not seen it, supported them, they've missed opportunities, they haven't fulfilled potential, they've beaten themselves up for, all the things that ADHDers struggle with because of our wiring. They've beaten themselves up for that. Just, I'm lazy, I'm dumb, I'm unmotivated, like a whole bunch of, not great words. So that's definitely a very common reaction. And particularly in perimenopause, where you get the irritability as well and the anger as well. So you can get some
I don't know what you're talking about there.
responses. But it's often followed by relief. So if relief's not the first response, it does come eventually, because it now helps explain a lot of things. And I think, sure, we can use ADHD as something to flog ourselves with, like, oh, I'm an ADHDer and that's a terrible thing. But what I find most often is that it explains a lot, and it provides us with a means of self-compassion. It's a way for us to recognize that, we're not intentionally having, being these kind of disorganized, late, last minute, emotional, chaotic people. There is a reason for some of those kind of challenges and qualities. And of course, no ADHD is the same, by the way. It all kind of is experienced differently and expressed differently. Yeah.
And I found that a lot, because my thing is I actually get very scared to be late to anything. So everyone's like, oh, you're always so prompt and on time. I'm like, yes, but that's out of a fear of having poor time management and doing the wrong thing. And, realizing that it was, because that was one of my things. It's like, oh, I'm organized, I'm always early. And it's like, but don't plan anything beforehand, even if it's hours beforehand, because I will start to stress and get anxiety.
Yeah, because you lose track of time. I mean, I was raised, my parents are gorgeous people. My dad spent some time in the army in his early adulthood. My mum was a nurse. So those professions really kind of create a lot of organizational qualities in people. I'm very sure it's my father who's an ADHD. But what that meant was I was raised with routine and structure, not overtly so, not rigidity by any means, but systems and ways of doing things, which I've brought into adulthood. So the interesting thing for me is, prior to perimenopause, I was very similar to you. I had the theory, if I'm 15 minutes early, I'm on time. If I was 10 minutes early, I'm late. And I worked that way, and certainly in terms of therapy sessions being about 50 minutes to 60 minutes. Yeah, sometimes I could kind of really be pushing that 61, 62 kind of minute thing, which might make me a little bit late for the next client and stuff. But it was nothing drastic. Since perimenopause, and I'm now postmenopausal, and it's still a challenge for me, I've actually found it really difficult to be on time. And I never used to. And it's an interesting experience. Like, I have such frustration with myself. I try and have compassion too, but I do have a lot of frustration with myself, because I also know that was something that I was capable of with a lot of effort previously. And I think that's the difference, is that even though I'm kind of on the other side, I've had my hump day of the day of menopause, I'm still very much impacted by kind of hormones, and that's a whole other conversation. I'm not absorbing any of the estrogen that I seem to try and put into my system. It's very frustrating. And estrogen is very relevant for ADHDers, because it helps dopamine function better. So, I am very estrogen depleted, despite my efforts not to be. And it's hard for me to know that I'm someone who's late. I've got such negative connotations to that. But as try as I might, and some days I'm better than others, but overall, it's something that I'm not as capable of now as I was prior to hitting my perimenopausal years.
So what do you think is one of the causes why women are often diagnosed or misdiagnosed with ADHD? Why is it coming later in life? Because we're seeing this trend where everyone's coming out of the woodworks.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a number of answers and a number of reasons. Most things don't ever come down to kind of one reason alone. So I guess the first thing that I wanted to maybe mention is I do think there might come a time, I don't know if it's in my lifetime, where we actually start just recognizing that all brains are diverse, and that, essentially we're all very unique. Our brains are very unique. Yes, you can kind of probably you'll still be able to shuffle people into kind of categories if you want to do that in some ways. But, I hope that in some ways it becomes obsolete, and the only way for that to happen is for us to, as a whole society, to really be very positive, I guess, about the diversity, about the skills, about the challenges, about the talents, all of that kind of stuff, and be able to accommodate difference a heck of a lot more. So that's my first thing. So I actually think over time we'll find that, there's a lot of ADHDers floating around, and maybe just as many as neurotypical, shall we say. But in the interim, what we now know is a couple of things. So the first thing is, like all health research, including mental health research and criteria for diagnosing mental health issues and neurodevelopmental conditions, which is what ADHD kind of sits under. Don't want to call it a disorder. It's all based on males, and particularly when it comes to ADHD, it's based on boys. And our DSM, I think we're up to number 5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that most of us use. It sets out the criteria to diagnose all sorts of different things. That the most recent one, I think, took 12 to 15 years to update, as it was, like of concerted, heads around the table, challenging the existing criteria and looking at research and making some tweaks and stuff. So we're a long way from DSM 6. Let's just say that. So in the meantime, we have criteria in our diagnostic manual that is still based on what ADHD typically looks like in boys. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that, yes, ADHD can look the same in girls. In terms of that, the kid that can't sit still and bouncing off the walls and all of that kind of thing. But it does tend to, girls tend to demonstrate some of the hyperactivity and impulsivity in a more subtle way. So the movement, for example, whereas boys might be quite obvious in their movement, and, as I said, rocking on chairs and getting up and moving around all the time, and just very, very physical, for girls, some of that hyperactivity, there's two things that I think are relevant to mention. That certainly weren't picked up when we were kids. It wasn't seen as fitting into the criteria of hyperactivity and impulsivity. So one is that our physical hyperactivity can be a lot more subtle. So girls twirl their hair, they chew their nails, they pick their fingers.
I shouldn't be picking fingers. Yeah.
It's terrible. Hence why I've got a Band-Aid on my thumb. But, or they, they might move in their, I've always been told, geez, you move a lot in your chair, by my clients. And I'm like, oh yeah, I just kind of can't get comfortable for very long. That's what I thought. Or we cross our legs and we shake one leg, and, more subtle, but the other way hyperactivity tends to show up for girls can be in their chatterbox. So, school reports might say she talks too much, or she, would learn more if she was a bit quieter. We say at times we blurt things out, we interrupt people, we finish people's sentences, we might say inappropriate things, a lot of foot and mouth kind of experiences. So that's another way that the hyperactivity, so that's more a verbal. And then some females won't show any of that, but the hyperactivity is in their mind. And if they talk about it, that's often when they start getting a diagnosis of anxiety rather than ADHD. And so we've got scenarios where I said, so for example, as I said, the criteria is based on what is typical for boys, although boys can not show up typically as well. My second certainly doesn't. The other version is that we've got a much broader perspective of how hyperactivity and impulsivity can show up as well. So that's the other thing. I think the other factor is that we have greater access to information. So, if you kind of think, I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, I couldn't just Google something. My parents couldn't have Googled, why is she always doing whatever, and found an answer. And so you'd just be relying on teachers and health professionals if you were coming across them. If your kids were coming across them back then, you'd be relying on them alerting you to anything unusual. And for girls particularly who are quiet and it's far more subtle, they probably wouldn't come to the attention of teachers. They're going to most likely be seen as quiet, compliant, sure, chatty, and yep, chatty can be a bit frustrating in the classroom, but it's not as frustrating as the kid that's kind of bouncing off the walls and getting out of their chair all the time and, you know, interrupting while they're giving their lesson and stuff. So we hear about things, you know, in society now, and we can Google them and we can find out more, and that therefore we can start to think, oh, maybe that's me, or maybe that's my kid. So that's definitely one of the things as well. We actually know that women are more likely to be diagnosed with anxiety and or depression than they are ADHD in comparison to males and men. So there's also that kind of gender bias in just, you know, which is, again, I mean, this is very common. Medical misogyny is what we refer to it as, where men and women go into a doctor for pain. Women will come out with antidepressants. Men will come out with pain medication. There's loads of research that shows that, because we're just still seen through this almost neurotic and, you know, kind of emotional lens. I think the final reason why it's happening in midlife is also very, you know, kind of relevant to what we've been talking about, and that's perimenopause. And so, you know, as I mentioned before, estrogen is really important for us as women in so many ways. And it's really important to our dopamine, and dopamine is relevant to ADHD. And so what we know, when there's only emerging research in the perimenopause ADHD kind of space. But what we know from women who have known their ADHDers prior to entering this stage of life is they would often experience either the medication becoming less effective in the luteal phase, so that's in the phase just before their period, or they kind of the same, different side of the same coin, they'd find their ADHD kind of challenges peak in the luteal phase. The luteal phase is when our estrogen drops. And so women who have known for some time that they're ADHDers and maybe taking their medication, they may well, with their psychiatrist kind of guidance, do what's called cycle dosing. And that would be that they would adjust their medication according to where they were in their cycle. So rather than being on exactly the same thing every single day of every single week of every single month, they may well change it. And so that's not new information at all. And it's what's helping to explain why in perimenopause the challenges of ADHD are more obvious, more pronounced, and our capacity to mask and use our compensatory strategies is reduced. Because perimenopause, yes, there's big peaks where our estrogen's off the charts, but generally it's an overall decline in our estrogen. It's kind of jokingly, loosely referred to as one long luteal phase, which is also explains why we get angry so often. One of the reasons. The other is the patriarchy, but don't get me started on that. But you know, I think that so as I said, you know, it's not just one reason why diagnoses are happening for midlife women. There's a whole bunch of factors that are coming into play. The one that will continue, like, so if we now know how ADHD can look in women, we can be alert to it. If we know how it can look in girls, we can be alert to it. But what probably we might be more aware, and therefore more younger girls, younger women will be diagnosed than in our generation, for example. But what won't necessarily change is that perimenopausal period. If you live long enough, you're going to go through perimenopause. And, you know, even if you know you're an ADHDer, you might find increased challenges during that period of time. The cool thing is you'll be aware of it. You know, hopefully you'll understand how your cycle impacts your ADHD and understand what perimenopause is all about, so that you can be more proactive in as you kind of move into this particular life stage. But it's not how it is at the moment.
No, and I mean, fact of the matter, especially when we're talking things like medication, a lot of people don't realise a lot of the basis of medications are all done on male studies, because, and even female regulated medication was done on the basis of male studies because of our hormone imbalance between follicular and luteal phases.
Yes. So it's difficult to research.
We do. But I did want to touch on one of the things you said is like about not calling it a disorder. And it is, I heard the other day, and it was one of the most beautifully put things I found is it's not necessarily a disorder. It's more just a difference like between having blue eyes and brown eyes. It's just a different way your brain functions. So we've got it better than what we think. We just got to understand it.
Although I don't like the word disorder. I think what I know from having spoken with lots of people, neurodivergent people, including ADHD, is that some do feel as though they may not use the word disorder, but they might refer to it as a disability because they do feel so challenged by, their brain and how, how it makes life difficult for them. Whereas others would really not want to have, would not identify with that at all. And so within the neurodivergent community, it's, I guess, important to remove the term disorder for sure, because it is a difference. But for some people, that difference does feel very impairing, is very impairing. And does make life truly difficult. And to be honest, one of the criteria for ADHD is that it actually has to have a functional impairment in the first place. So I certainly have had clients who they are very sure, and I am too, that they are ADHDers, but they would say it doesn't impair their lives. And so for them, disorder doesn't fit, disabled doesn't fit. And in many ways, they wouldn't necessarily see the challenges that they have as too big a deal. But I think that is perhaps a minority. I think what we need to do is just really accept that, your experience, Leanne, is your experience. If you find certain things challenging because of how your brain's wired, then that's just how it is. And I may find similar things challenging. I also may find some different things challenging because, as I said, ADHD is experienced and expressed differently.
So I have a dog dreaming in the background here at the moment. But so what do you think we come into this bit where we've all got these societal roles and expectations and like gender roles. How do you think that will also contribute? Because I know growing up, one of my things was girls don't have ADHD. And we've come a long way to prove that's very wrong.
Yep.
But what's your take on that?
Well, I think one of the great things about the internet is that, as the average person, most people can access it and can start to recognize that, yes, ADHD is, is relevant for genders and non-binary folk. And, it's really just about, let's have a look at what's going on for you. In terms of the challenges and things, to then start to make decisions around whether somebody has ADHD or not, and not, just ignore one whole gender, for example, just because. So I think those things are really, really important. And, we're learning that in lots of different ways in health in general. The signs of a heart attack in men are different from women. We didn't know that for a long time, which is why the mortality rate for women with a heart attack was much higher than for men, because we were paying attention to the wrong things and weren't getting medical assistance soon enough. So there's lots of different ways that this gender bias plays out. I think what needs to change, there's so many reasons why it needs to change. There's nothing, it's not by far not just about ADHD, but I certainly think that while women are still undertaking the primary mental load in family systems and in homes, that they're the very, very things that ADHDers particularly struggle with. And so for me, it's no surprise that during midlife, when all the research shows that we're at our busiest, we're under the most stress, we have the most responsibilities and demands on our time, our headspace, our energy, our money as women. And if we're still doing the lion's share of the mental load for ourselves and the other
Mm-hmm.
people in our family, then this is a particularly challenging time. As I said, it's not cool. I would like to see far more equity for sure, generally. But as an ADHDer, it really becomes an extremely challenging thing, because we may have been able to manage all of that prior to perimenopause in particular, maybe not as well as perhaps a neurotypical person, but, well enough. And then you hit midlife and you're depleted, you're losing your estrogen. So your ADHD is even worse than it ever has been. And yet we're still expected by our family members, by our communities, by society, to still be doing everyone's thinking for them and planning and organizing. And they're the things that are most difficult for us. So, there's so much that has to change. And I don't know if anyone's read the book, The Year I Met My Brain. It was written by an Australian young woman. It's a really cool one. There are quite a few books out there that you can read that share, relevant, accurate information as well as people's stories. They often are a combination of or the ADHDers, as they call them, so a dual diagnosis of ADHD and autism. And so there are some parts of those stories that those of us who are ADHD only would not necessarily identify with. But The Year I Met My Brain is written by a young woman who is an ADHDer. And what I remember being smacked in the face, felt like a punch in the face, when I read something to the effect of how she observed the expectation that she felt was on her as a young woman to be organized, to eat well. She was living independently, to eat well, to keep the house clean, to be on top of all the washing, all of those kinds of things. And if she wasn't, the negative view people would have of her, versus a young man in his early 20s who didn't eat well, wasn't on top of his washing, had a messy house, and blah, blah, blah. And that would be viewed differently. That would just be, a young man who's too busy off living life and all the rest, and all of that. She also then added to the conversation how when relationships begin, that it's still expected that it's the female that's carrying all the mental load and the organizational kind of stuff, and how hard that is if the female is an ADHDer. So, I think these are really, really relevant conversations generally. We want to see more fairness in how family systems and homes run and all of that kind of stuff, for sure. But it becomes really, really more obvious and problematic when we hit this stage of life.
And, I know and I'll always only ever talk for me because I can never talk for someone else. But for me, it was, especially when you'd get paralyzed by the overwhelm, and then all of a sudden there's a house full of work to do. There's dishes in the sink and the laundry, and you need a vac. And all of a sudden you wouldn't be able to move. I would literally be stuck in there. And I found that the worse I felt about myself, the more I was stuck there.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, my bit of a light bulb moment was thinking, do you know what? It's okay to feel this way. And once I actually gave myself permission to feel stuck, I found that there might be one task I could tick off. And, once you tick that task off and you feel good, okay, all right.
Yeah.
It was so much better. But the more I put on myself, the more paralysis I would experience with it.
Absolutely. And it kind of, I have to admit, it's never really made sense to me, people who, for example, go to personal trainers that are barking at them and yelling at them and, saying terrible, mean things, because that just would not motivate me whatsoever. I know it works for some, but if you think we can have that kind of mean, nasty internal voice. And if we have that, for me, it makes complete sense that it's paralyzing. It just makes us feel even worse. We need to feel at our best and capable and worthy and all the rest to be able to kind of actualize a lot of different things, particularly things that are boring. I mean, our brain is wired for novelty, urgency. It is not wired for important. Important is not important enough, you know.
Important's important when you've got a 5-minute deadline to reach.
Well, exactly. And, you know, then because now it's urgent.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a really important thing to understand. But yeah, the compassion element and the patience with oneself is really, really important. Interestingly, I think midlife is a time when a lot of women actually start to push back on the expectations they have of them broadly, and also in the family home, where they start kind of like, hang on a minute, why am I the only one that's picking this up off the floor, or doing the washing, or doing, you know, all of those bits and pieces around the house? And it's tough work to change the dance that's been danced in a family home. If you're someone who's done that all the time, you know, it just becomes how things roll in the family system, and it takes a lot of effort and courage and persistence to, you know, really make a dent in that dynamic and those expectations. I think it's even more important for women with ADHD, because it's just too much for us. For a period of time, we are going through something really significant in midlife that does reduce our capacity to varying degrees, for all of us, whether we're neurotypical or whether we're neurodivergent. And when you add neurodivergence into the mix, then the reduction is even more obvious. And we don't like it. I don't like feeling I'm less capable than I was of certain things. But I've arrived at a place where most of the time, I can actually kind of accept that. And there's also parts of me that doesn't want to return to the one that does it all the time for everyone. I think I have a phrase where in midlife women want to stop helping others actualize their potential and start focusing on actualizing their own. And I think that's a natural inclination that we have. And if we follow that, it also supports us in our ADHD-ness as well.
And leading on from that, you know, a big thing is how can women advocate for themselves? Like, how do they find their voice to go, look, this is what I need?
Oh gosh, that's a really, really big question, because I think there are some who I find, I guess, are so depleted or desperate that they either have others step in, the others see the how much they're struggling and start to step in, and women can reluctantly accept it. Maybe because they're just not coping so well, you know, they can't fight it, they don't have the energy to fight it. I think other women start to find their voice, and they need champions behind them, which are typically other women, to encourage them and to remind them that it is actually okay. Because in my experience, and certainly the perinatal clients I used to work with, right through to midlife women and beyond, we are really taught from a very, very young age as females that we are supposed to care for other people first. We're supposed to prioritize their needs. We're supposed to do things for them. We're supposed to think for them. We're supposed to plan for them. And of course, when we've got young people that we are responsible for, that's part and parcel of it. But we continue for too long. But that's the messaging that we are up against. And it can be really, really difficult. I don't know any mum, as an example, who's come home from a day of work and their teenage or young adult children have said to them, "Oh my God, Mum, you are so tired. I can see that. Let me do the washing for tonight." And the other one say, "Yeah, and I'll cook dinner and clean up afterwards." You know, like it just... there's a lot to change, and we need to take small, persistent action to push up against what I call it the dance. So the dynamic, or the, the unspoken or spoken expectations in a family system or a society that says we are supposed to be doing all of this stuff. So we need to identify what we most want to be able to let go of, what we most want to delegate. And we need to be reminded that what we're asking is completely reasonable, because that's often where I see women, oh, maybe I should, maybe, oh, they're very busy. They've got ATAR at the moment, or, oh, I've heard it all. Look, I've said it all. I'm far from, I have not got this nailed. It's a persistent thing. And it's because, I have people that remind me that what I'm asking of my teenage, young adult children in the house is actually very, very reasonable. And then I guess there's scenarios where the patterns and the habits and the templates within us, we call them schemas as psychologists, are so, so powerful that it happens in every domain of their life and is almost invisible. It happens, it's just so automatic. And often, a good dose of therapy is going to be what's required to start to make those changes and build a robust, healthy version of themselves who can be assertive and stick to their boundaries, implement them and stick to them.
And just on that, how, because it's one thing to do the social advocacy and home life. What about the medical advocacy? Because I know for myself, having that first point of contact where someone goes, "You're not ADHD," and bringing that doubt to myself. And it wasn't until literally I had to start going through the dance with my son that I realized, sorry, mate, I know exactly where you've gotten it from. How do women advocate for themselves in the medical field to get their diagnosis?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And where there's a couple of different ways. So one way women could start is to not walk into their doctor and say, I think I'm ADHD, I Googled it. Unfortunately, I think the minute that we bring Google up, that there's a bit of a, oh, here we go, is it Google or is it TikTok? But I think going to resources like the Australian ADHD Foundation, like legitimate organisations that are, where there are professionals that are members of those organisations, is a really good start, because those places will have fact sheets, information sheets. Some of them also have screeners, so they're not diagnostic by any means. But they do screen for the possibility of ADHD. Some of them may also have questionnaires that a loved one can kind of answer as well. So a partner or a sibling, an adult sibling, or a parent, because we're talking about midlife women now advocating for themselves. So, going to your doctor with some really legitimate information, rather than just I Googled or I saw on Instagram or TikTok, and kind of just saying, this is what I think is happening for me. And I've read on these sites, and you could even give a copy of what you've read to them. You could give a copy of some of the results of the screeners if you've done them. And, kind of say, I'd really like a referral to be assessed. So there's a couple of different assessment pathways, though. And one is obviously psychiatry, in which case to get a Medicare rebate, you'll need a GP referral for that. And if you definitely want to be on medication, or you think you want to be on medication, you are going to have a diagnosis from a psychiatrist, because they're going to be the ones that need to be prescribing that kind of medication. The other alternative, the other pathway, is to see a psychologist who has expertise in ADHD. And there's people who have expertise in diagnosing in children, and then there's those who are children and adults, those who are adults. I only work with midlife women generally, because I think they're awesome and that keeps me happy. So I wouldn't be diagnosing a midlife male. Like, I don't work anymore with men. I don't diagnose children, anything like that. So you could access an assessment with a psychologist. And some of us kind of have a two-part process. I have a 2-part process, and that 2-part process is we do some screening, I have a chat, give some feedback. And if that process says you know, ADHD is likely, they can either stop it there, I'll write a letter and they can take that to their doctor or their psychiatrist or both, or they can continue with the assessment, the full assessment process with me and get a diagnosis and do the same thing. Kind of, they've gone through the whole process and they can give that information to the medical people. The reason I do it in 2 parts is it gives people the option that if halfway through that process I'm saying to them, I don't think it's ADHD from what you've said and all the bits and pieces we've done, then I'm able to direct them more accurately to what things might be or where they might go or whatever. And they're not necessarily, like, you know, they're not cheap processes because they're very, very time consuming, both in front of the person and behind the scenes as the psychologist. And it just gives people more choice. Some people will roll out the whole process, and there's nothing unethical about that. That's just how they roll. My experience and the feedback I get is that psychologists, the process that psychologists take people through, because there's more parts to it and more contact with the person before a diagnosis is made, it's often experienced as far more neuroaffirming and an experience where they actually develop a deeper understanding of themselves. They still might want to pursue more kind of therapy or sessions or whatever to extend and expand on that understanding, but it's certainly they get a lot more than just a diagnosis out of it, shall we say. That's the feedback that I get. But we can't prescribe. Psychologists can't prescribe. So what I tend to say to people, psychiatrists have very long wait lists, is if you're considering medication, get your referral from your GP as soon as you can and get on a wait list as soon as you can. If you are desperate to get a diagnosis, like you really, really want to know, then you would be able to get into a psychologist quicker, and you can do that as well. There's no harm. It's just costly. And if you're not interested in medication at all, then you don't have to go to a psychiatrist. You could see, well, you can, but you can also see a psychologist if medication is just not something that you're going to consider. So they're the different pathways. And you don't need a referral to see a psychologist for an ADHD assessment. And ADHD assessments do not fall under mental health care plan. So you can't get an assessment and use a mental health care plan. And I mention that because if you have a mental health care plan for therapy or anything, that comes from a doctor. So you would need to see a GP to get a mental health care plan, but you cannot use that. It doesn't meet the criteria for mental health care plan and ADHD assessment. Treatment is, therapy is, but not the assessment.
And that's good to know, because a lot of people don't realise just how accessible it is. Like you said, it is costly. There is a lot to go through it, and you know, it's also very, I'd say, an eye-opening process as well.
Yeah.
But there's so many more options that we have these days, which is, like, it's just fantastic to, you know, what we did have going. Even, you know, I was in primary school in the 80s, and it just wasn't even considered.
You know,
so
there's support out there for sure for people. And look, I do see people who've just self-diagnosed, and we roll with that. Like if that's they've done their reading, their thinking, their experience, and they come to me, and that's how they feel, and that's where they land. You know, we roll with. I don't say you've got to go and I have to do an assessment, or you've got to go and get a diagnosis. But I do think the process is super, super helpful for people to go through. I think there's many things, as you said, that you learn about yourself, that you learn about ADHD as well, that are beneficial. So, yeah.
But as always, as I expected, actually, we've gone over time, which I actually really, really love, because I think, you know, luckily we don't have wine because it would go on for much longer.
Daytime.
Thank you so much for giving me your time and being part of the podcast.
My pleasure.
For people who, especially our midlife beauties who are suspecting that they're ADHD, how do they get in contact with you?
Yeah, so I do have my books closed at the moment. That's largely because I'm about to skive off for a bit of a holiday. As we approach Christmas and stuff, I've got most of January off. But they can certainly email me through the All About Her Centre website. I'm also on Instagram, the Midlife Psychologist, with underscores between each word. They can get in touch with me there. I am going to be doing a kind of webinar/workshop, which is on the website as well, around ADHD. So people are more than welcome to sign up for that. And, you know, depending on the interest in that, I may well be putting together a coaching program for midlife ADHDers, women, of course. Yeah, and that will always be through a neuroaffirming lens. So I'm not going to be, you know, flogging anyone with the dreadfulness of ADHD. I'll be validating the challenges, but I think we need to also have a strengths-based approach and a realistic approach, because a lot of strategies that people suggest are actually best. They're not going to work for us. They're for neurotypical people. So if we try them, we'll fail and we'll feel crap about ourselves. So I don't want to set up anyone to have that experience. So yeah.
I just love the phrase neuroaffirming, because I hadn't heard it before, you know, we started talking. But we do have a couple of comments that have come through while we've been talking. Lara has been with us from the start to finish, saying that we both look gorgeous today. So thank you very, very much. And also that the podcast has been insightful, and thank you for raising and discussing the topic. But she wants to know if someone diagnosis. Sorry,
yeah.
I just had a pop up as soon as I was reading it. What's the help available and from where?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess really what we're looking at, I'm pretty sure Kirstin, for a start, Kirstin are running an ADHD group. I think it's for adults, definitely. I'm not sure whether it's specific to midlife adults or maybe early adults, given it's run from Kirstin, but people could look into that. There's the ADHD coaches as well. So again, if you Google, and I'm having word finding difficulties right now, so I'm sorry I can't be specific, but there are a number of Australian organisations that are professional bodies of ADHD practitioners. If you Google that, you'll get to the right places. They have ADHD coaches. Some of them have a teaching background, some of them lived experience, and then have gone on to do some kind of coaching qualification and combine that with their ADHD knowledge. And then there are psychologists on there as well. But yeah, I mean, you can definitely, as I said, the support for ADHD does fit into the criteria for a mental health care plan. So you could seek a mental health care plan from your GP and get support that way as well. So yeah, there's a number of different avenues for that.
And of course, if you want to contact Kirstin, you're also on our website.
Yes, yes, definitely.
If you're on the BWA website, go there and you'll see her gorgeous face. Marie's just made a comment of that she's been loving this podcast, and Carly's come through and said, oh my goodness, yes, I've coped for decades, but it's getting harder in this middle age.
Yeah, I know. I know that feeling.
Yeah. I still refuse to believe that I ever left my 30s.
Oh, I'm 50 in about 10 days. And I'm so excited. So no, I don't mind not being in my 30s. I'm really looking forward to 50. But I definitely relate to Carly. It is getting harder. But you know what? In some ways, if women didn't have the expectations on us that are on us, maybe it wouldn't be so hard. Something to think about.
Thank you so much again for joining us, and for everyone who's out there. I love the fact that, you know, we've had people live and everyone following up on the podcasting stations, and we will chat again soon.
Thanks so much, Leanne.
Thank you.
Awesome.
You have been listening to the Business Women Australia podcast show. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode and gained some valuable insights to empower you on your journey. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe to stay updated in our latest episodes. And if you're not already a member of Business Women Australia, What are you waiting for? Head to our website today and join so that you can connect with a thriving community of inspiring women across Australia. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.